Hello, my name is Emily, and I want to share with you a story that still gives people chills in aviation circles, a true account that blends intuition, fear, and something no one could quite explain. It was a long-haul flight across the Arctic route, one of those journeys that test both endurance and patience. The crew of Flight 472 had settled into rhythm, passengers asleep under dim cabin lights, the hum of engines steady, and the air thin but calm. Among the attendants was Lila, one of the newest on the team, eager to prove herself. She had only been with the airline for 8 months, and this was her first assignment on the polar route. The others joked about how endless those hours could feel, with nothing but the soft glow of the northern lights beyond the windows to break the monotony. By mid-flight, they were several hours north of Greenland, deep in the polar airspace where communication was patchy and ground signals were thin. The flight deck had reported clear skies ahead and smooth air, perfect conditions for an uneventful cruise. The passengers were relaxed, some half asleep, others watching quiet movies or sipping tea. Everything was normal until something changed in Lila's face. She was serving drinks in the rear galley when she suddenly froze mid-motion. Her colleague Sandra noticed her hand trembling slightly as she poured orange juice into a cup. Lila's expression went blank for a moment, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as if she'd heard something faint, something distant. Sandra asked if she was all right, but Lila didn't respond right away. Then, almost under her breath, she said, "We're going to lose pressure soon." Sandra frowned, unsure she had heard correctly. "What did you say?" Lila blinked, as though coming back to herself, and whispered, "The cabin, we're going to lose pressure." Her voice was soft, but the certainty in it made Sandra's skin prickle. "Did you see something?" she asked quickly, glancing at the panel lights by the galley. All indicators were green. No warnings. No system lights. No sound of leaking air or shifting pressure. Lila shook her head. "No, but it's going to happen," she said again, quieter this time, like she was afraid of the words themselves. Sandra thought maybe Lila was feeling lightheaded. It wasn't uncommon on long flights, especially on polar routes, where humidity drops and oxygen levels feel thinner. She suggested Lila sit down, maybe grab a sip of water, but Lila insisted she was fine, though her hands stayed clenched at her sides. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to tell the captain." Sandra hesitated. You didn't just walk into the cockpit mid-cruise unless it was important, but something about the way Lila spoke, the way her face had drained of all color, made her nod. Together, they went forward, through the silent cabin where most passengers were asleep under blankets. When the cockpit door opened, Captain Raymond looked up with mild surprise. "Everything all right back there?" he asked, glancing between the two attendants. Lila stood there, still pale, clutching the edge of the jump seat for support. Her lips trembled slightly before she spoke. "Captain," she said quietly, "we're going to lose pressure soon." For a moment, no one said anything. The captain blinked, puzzled. His co-pilot, Jensen, looked over his shoulder, eyebrows raised. "What makes you say that?" he asked gently. Lila shook her head. "I don't know, No, please, can you check?" Captain Raymond wasn't the kind of man to dismiss crew concerns. He'd been flying for over 20 years, long enough to know that intuition sometimes warned you before instruments did. Still, he looked at the pressurization gauges. Everything read normal. The cabin altitude was steady, the differential pressure perfect. There wasn't a single red or amber light flashing anywhere. He gave her a calm smile. "Everything's in order, Lila. The systems are fine. You might be feeling a bit off. These long polar flights can do that." But Lila didn't seem comforted. She stepped closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "Captain, I heard someone say it. Right here." She touched her right ear lightly, as if remembering the exact spot where the voice had brushed against her skin. "It wasn't a dream. Someone said, 'You're going to lose pressure soon.' It sounded like they were standing right behind me." The captain exchanged a look with Jensen, both uncertain how to respond. Jensen tried to keep things professional. Could it have been a passenger nearby? Lila shook her head firmly. I was alone in the galley. No one was there. The captain's tone softened. All right, he said after a pause. We'll keep an eye on the gauges. You go have a seat and take a few deep breaths. If anything changes, you'll be the first to know. Lila nodded slowly but didn't seem convinced. She left the cockpit quietly, returning to her seat near the rear cabin. Sandra followed her, uneasy but trying not to show it. Minutes passed. 10, maybe 12. The captain checked the instruments again and radioed a brief status report to flight control. All normal. Jensen leaned back, half smiling. Guess her nerves got the best of her, he said. But before Raymond could reply, a sharp alarm pierced the calm. Both pilots jerked forward instinctively. The pressurization warning light flashed amber, followed by a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Oxygen masks deployed with a hiss throughout the cabin. The automatic systems kicked in, but the altitude was already dropping faster than expected. The captain and Jensen immediately donned their masks and initiated an emergency descent to a breathable altitude. Passengers screamed, startled from their sleep. The cabin crew moved swiftly, following procedure to secure everyone while staying calm. Amid the chaos, Sandra glanced toward Lila. She wasn't panicking. She was just sitting still, eyes closed, her expression unreadable, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. Within minutes, the plane leveled off. The emergency was contained. The crew reassured passengers that everything was under control. The mechanical cause turned out to be a minor failure. A small valve had cracked under pressure, something that could have gone unnoticed during inspections. Maintenance crews later confirmed it had been deteriorating for some time, a failure that might have turned serious if the captain hadn't acted as quickly as he did. When they landed safely in Helsinki, Lila didn't speak much. While the rest of the crew headed for debriefing, she stayed behind, staring out at the frozen tarmac through the aircraft window. Sandra asked her softly, "How did you know?" Lila turned, eyes distant. "Someone told me," she said simply. "Someone whispered it in my ear." There was no trace of confusion in her voice, just quiet certainty. After that, she never flew again. The airline recorded her account, labeling it a stress reaction, but the others, the pilots, the attendants, even the maintenance crew, remembered the timing, the warning, and the way she had said it before the instruments knew. Some things, they agreed later, can't be explained by training manuals or system data. Some things are simply known before they happen. The cabin had settled into that rare quiet every long-haul crew hopes for. Lights dimmed, passengers asleep, the engines humming like distant thunder. Outside, it was endless darkness, an ocean of frozen clouds stretching over the pole. Inside, everything was steady, smooth flight, no turbulence, no alarms. The air pressure was perfect, oxygen levels normal. For the next 10 minutes, after Lila's strange warning, life returned to routine, or so it seemed. Sandra tried to brush it off. She'd seen new attendants crack under fatigue before. The long hours, recycled air, and eerie calm of a polar flight could mess with anyone's head. But something about Lila's eyes kept replaying in her mind. They weren't panicked, not really. More like she'd already seen what was coming. Lila, on the other hand, sat strapped into the jump seat near the rear galley, still pale but quiet. She tried to steady her breathing. Her fingers trembled slightly against her lap. The whisper she'd heard still echoed in her mind. Clear, close, and cold. We're going to lose pressure soon. It hadn't sounded threatening, just certain, as if whoever or whatever said it already knew the script. She tried convincing herself it was her imagination, but the words kept returning with unnerving precision. In the cockpit, Captain Raymond kept his promise. He double-checked the pressurization controls and cross-verified the readings with his co-pilot Jensen. Everything was normal. The gauges were steady. Cabin altitude held at 8,000 feet equivalent. Jensen half smiled. "Guess our recruits got nerves." Raymond nodded slightly but didn't look away from the panel. "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes instincts come before instruments." He'd learned that lesson long ago. Machines fail, and sometimes people sense what systems can't. Still, after 10 minutes of calm air and flawless readings, even he started to relax. In the cabin, the silence began to feel heavy. A mother adjusted her child's blanket. A man near the window leaned back and closed his eyes. One of the attendants rolled the drink cart quietly down the aisle. Everything felt normal, almost too normal. The air was cool and crisp. Then it shifted. It was so subtle at first that no one noticed. A faint pop in the ears, a tiny flicker of static in the cabin speakers. Lila felt it before she saw anything, the strange, weightless feeling behind her forehead, the pressure change that wasn't supposed to happen. Her heart skipped. She looked up. Sandra noticed her sudden stiffness. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Lila didn't answer. She just reached up instinctively, like she was bracing for something invisible. Then came the sound, a sharp hiss, faint but unmistakable, the kind of noise that every flight attendant prays they'll never hear. A few passengers glanced around, confused. Before anyone could react, the overhead lights flickered. A second later, the cabin pressure warning blared through the aircraft. Masks dropped from the ceiling with a rush of air, swinging wildly as passengers screamed. "Cabin depressurization!" Sandra shouted, her voice trained but urgent. Years of safety drills kicked in. She grabbed her own mask, pulled it tight, and motioned to the passengers to do the same. Lila moved faster than anyone. She'd already fitted her mask and was helping the elderly couple beside her. The plane tilted slightly as the captain initiated an emergency descent. In the cockpit, the alarms lit up like fireworks. "Cabin altitude rising, 10,000 and climbing," Jensen read out. Raymond's voice was sharp, calm, and practiced. "Emergency descent, FL 290, masks on." He pitched the aircraft down in a controlled dive, reducing altitude fast enough to equalize pressure without losing stability. The oxygen systems kicked in automatically, but the warning sirens didn't stop until they leveled off several thousand feet lower. Back in the cabin, it was chaos mixed with calm control. The crew moved down the aisles, ensuring everyone had their masks secured. A few passengers were crying. One man fainted briefly from panic, but within minutes, the situation stabilized. The oxygen masks hung limp now, swaying slightly in the light turbulence. As the air pressure normalized, Sandra knelt beside Lila. "You all right?" she asked. Lila didn't answer right away. Her mask still covered her face, but her eyes were open wide, unfocused, as if she were listening for something. When she finally spoke, her voice was muffled but clear enough to make Sandra shiver. "It happened," she said softly, "just like they said." When the captain came over the intercom, his voice was steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced a minor pressurization issue. Everything is under control. We've descended to a safe altitude, and the situation has been stabilized." His tone was calm, measured, the voice of a man who knew exactly what to say to stop panic. Maintenance crews later found the cause, a hairline crack in a cabin pressure valve, invisible to the eye and missed during routine checks. It had finally given way, allowing air to escape faster than the system could compensate. A small mechanical failure, the kind that could happen on any flight, anywhere. But the timing of Lila's warning couldn't be ignored. After the oxygen masks were restowed and the passengers began to relax, the crew gathered briefly in the galley. Jensen came back from the cockpit, still looking puzzled. "You said she warned us?" he asked Sandra quietly. Sandra nodded. 10 minutes before it happened. Jensen frowned. "Did she see something?" Sandra hesitated. She said someone whispered it to her. He didn't laugh, didn't smirk, just stared at her for a moment, then shook his head. "Weird," he murmured, before heading back up front. Sandra looked at Lila, who sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She looked calm now, but in a way that didn't feel peaceful, more like someone who'd made peace with something she didn't understand. For the rest of the flight, she barely spoke. She performed her duties, smiled when spoken to, but her mind seemed far away. She didn't flinch at turbulence or react when the captain thanked the crew over the intercom. When they finally touched down in Helsinki hours later, the passengers applauded the landing, unaware how close they'd come to danger or how strange the warning had been that preceded it. That night, in the hotel after the debriefing, Sandra tried asking her again, "Lila, what made you say that? How did you know?" Lila looked at her, eyes tired but steady. "It wasn't me who knew," she said. "Someone told me, just whispered it, like they were right behind me." Sandra felt the back of her neck tighten. "Who?" Lila didn't answer. She just looked away toward the window, where snow was falling softly outside. "I don't think it matters who," she said finally. "They just wanted us to listen." From that night on, Lila never worked another flight. The others went back to routine. But every time the crew from Flight 472 got assigned the polar route again, someone would mention her name quietly, half in disbelief, half in respect, and remember the night a whisper came before the warning. The investigation began as soon as Flight 472 touched down in Helsinki. The airline's safety division and a team of engineers from Boeing were waiting on the ground, ready to examine what the flight log described as a sudden cabin depressurization event at cruise altitude. It was standard protocol after any mechanical anomaly, but what they found and what they heard from the crew made the report one of the strangest in the airline's history. Captain Raymond was the first to debrief. His account was calm and methodical. The flight had been uneventful until the cabin pressure suddenly dropped with no prior system alert. He emphasized that his crew had acted flawlessly and that the cause appeared to be mechanical, not procedural. When asked if there had been any prior indications or warnings, he hesitated, glancing briefly at the logbook before replying. "No official alerts," he said. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, "But one of our attendants said something about a possible pressure loss 10 minutes before it happened." The engineers looked at each other. "Based on instrument readings?" one asked. "No," the captain said quietly. "She just felt it, or said she was told." The airline's maintenance team began its inspection immediately. The aircraft, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, was taken to a hangar for a full systems check. Technicians examined every valve, seal, and duct linked to the environmental control system. At first, everything looked perfect. All automatic logs confirmed that the pressurization system had been functioning normally until the exact moment the failure occurred. That was when one of the engineers found it, a fine crack, no longer than an inch, on the outflow valve located near the tail section. It was the kind of flaw that could go unnoticed for months. Metal fatigue, caused by repeated pressurization cycles, had weakened the component. Eventually, under the constant stress of high-altitude flight, it gave way just enough to let the pressurized air leak faster than the system could handle. The automatic sensors caught it within seconds, but by then, the damage was done. The engineers logged it as a rare but not unprecedented mechanical defect. The captain was cleared of any responsibility. The airline issued a brief internal notice, emphasizing the importance of thorough valve inspections. But off the record, everyone kept talking about Lila. When her name came up in the internal report, it was described as crew intuition, a professional way of saying no one had any idea how she knew. The flight data recorder confirmed that her warning came almost exactly 10 minutes before the first pressure drop. Sandra's statement matched it precisely. "She said it twice," Sandra told investigators. "Once to me, once to the captain. She didn't look scared. She looked certain." The medical officer assigned to evaluate the crew noted that Lila had no signs of hypoxia or fatigue severe enough to cause hallucinations. Her vitals were normal, oxygen levels fine. When asked directly about what she'd heard, she was polite but detached. "It wasn't a voice I recognized," she said in her statement. "It was close, just by my right ear. Male, calm, maybe older. I thought it was one of the other attendants at first, but when I turned around, no one was there. Then it said, 'You're going to lose pressure soon.'" The interviewer pressed for details. "Was it a dream? A memory? Something she'd read? Lila shook her head. It wasn't in my head, she said simply. It was real, like someone standing right behind me. Psychologists later suggested it could have been a stress-induced auditory hallucination, a reaction to the high workload, cabin dryness, or sleep deprivation common among new attendants. But even they couldn't explain the timing, the accuracy. Hallucinations don't usually predict mechanical failures with minute-by-minute precision. Behind closed doors, a few senior engineers began to joke uneasily about the whisperer in the galley. But some of the older pilots didn't laugh. Captain Raymond, who'd logged more than 14,000 flight hours, told a colleague privately that he'd seen things over the years he couldn't explain. Strange electrical surges before storms, cockpit lights flickering right before turbulence hit, radios picking up ghostly static that sometimes sounded like words. Maybe we just don't know everything that happens up there, he said. As for the valve, Boeing's report concluded it had likely been cracked for several flights before finally giving way. It was sheer luck that the failure happened when it did, over an area where the crew could safely descend. Had it occurred during another segment, say, over the Russian Arctic, where temperatures drop to -60 and ground contact is nearly impossible, the outcome might have been far worse. When the maintenance chief briefed the captain and the crew later, he tried to keep the conversation technical. "You folks did everything right," he said. "The system gave way at altitude, but your response was textbook. You probably saved us a much bigger problem." Then he turned to Lila, who stood quietly at the edge of the group. "And you," he added with a faint, uncertain smile. "I don't know what kind of radar you've got, but it works." Lila didn't smile back. "It wasn't radar," she said softly. "It was a voice." He nodded awkwardly, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. Over the next few days, Lila stayed in Helsinki while the airline conducted post-incident evaluations. The others were cleared to return to work, but she didn't show up for the next rostered flight. When Sandra went to check on her, she found Lila sitting in her hotel room by the window, still wearing the small silver cross around her neck she always wore on flights. "You're not coming back, are you?" Sandra asked. Lila smiled faintly but didn't answer. She looked out at the gray sky, where another aircraft was climbing slowly into the clouds. "I used to love that sound," she said. "The engines are taking off. It used to mean freedom. Now it just sounds like something I'm not supposed to touch again." Sandra tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just her nerves, that maybe it was a coincidence. But Lila shook her head. "It wasn't a coincidence," she said quietly. "Someone wanted me to say it out loud, to warn them. Maybe that's all they needed from me." When she finally returned home, she filed her resignation without any explanation beyond personal reasons. She never flew again. The airline kept her file marked confidential, though her name still comes up among crews who hear the story. Some say she saved the flight through instinct. Others believe someone, was trying to keep those people safe that night. The final line in the technical report read, "Root cause, mechanical fatigue of the aft outflow valve, detected post-flight." But for everyone who'd been on board, the real question never made it into the report. How did she know before the instruments did? When Lila finally agreed to speak with the airline's safety investigator one last time, she looked more tired than frightened. She'd barely slept since the flight. The investigator, a calm, middle-aged woman named Karen Holt, had conducted dozens of post-incident interviews before, but something about Lila's composure unsettled her. Most attendants who experienced mid-air emergencies were shaken, emotional. Lila wasn't. She was pale, quiet, and strangely detached, as if what happened wasn't shocking, just inevitable. Karen started gently. "You told the captain you thought there would be a loss of pressure. Can you tell me again what led you to say that?" Lila nodded slowly. "I heard someone," she said. "It wasn't loud but close, like someone leaning in to speak quietly during service." Karen jotted notes. "A voice?" "Yes. Male, I think. Calm. I thought maybe one of the passengers had followed me to ask for something, but when I turned around, No one was there. What did the voice say? Lila hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. He said, "You're going to lose pressure soon." Just that. Nothing else. Karen looked up. "And you didn't recognize the voice?" "No," Lila said, shaking her head. "It didn't sound familiar. It wasn't one of the crew. I've flown with them enough to know everyone's voice. It was different, gentle, almost protective." Karen leaned back. "Could you have been imagining it? Cabin noise can play tricks on the mind, especially during long flights." Lila smiled faintly. "I thought about that too, but right after I heard it, I felt this pressure, like my ears popped, just slightly. I looked up at the ceiling panels, and for a second, it felt like the air shifted. That's when I told Sandra. I wasn't panicking. I just knew." There was no defensiveness in her tone, only quiet certainty. Karen had heard countless explanations for gut feelings, but this was different. The accuracy was too precise. 10 minutes before the mechanical failure, almost to the second, she noted the details, thanked Lila, and ended the session. But as Lila stood to leave, she added something unexpected. "I don't think it was the first time," she said softly. Karen paused. "What do you mean?" Lila looked toward the window, where the weak northern sunlight fell across the floor. "When I was a kid, my mother used to say I had an old soul. Once, when I was 12, we were driving on a mountain road in winter. I told her we needed to stop, that the car would slip soon. She laughed. 5 minutes later, we hit black ice. We spun, but stopped just before the edge. No one was hurt. She didn't laugh after that." Karen said nothing. Lila continued, "I've had it a few times since then. Small things. A word, a whisper, a feeling that something's about to break or change. It's not always right, but when it is, it's exact. Like someone giving me a warning." Karen closed her notebook. "Lila, what do you think that voice was?" Lila's gaze didn't waver. "I don't think it was something bad," she said. "It didn't want to scare me, it just wanted me to listen." She left soon after, walking out into the Helsinki cold with her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She didn't return to the airline office again. Back at headquarters, the incident became an odd footnote in the company's history. The official paperwork framed it as a combination of mechanical fault and crew alertness. But word of Lila's whisper spread quietly among flight attendants. Some dismissed it as a coincidence. Others swore it was more. A month later, Sandra received a postcard from Lila. There was no return address, only a picture of a small coastal village in Norway. The message inside was short. "Thank you for listening when no one else would. Tell the captain I'm grateful he trusted me, even when it didn't make sense. I don't think I'm meant to fly again. But I'm safe. I still hear them sometimes, softly. Not warnings this time, just peace." Sandra read it twice, then tucked it into her flight logbook and never spoke of it again. For the crew, the memory of that night never really faded. Every time they flew over the Arctic routes, the ones where communication goes quiet and the stars hang close to the horizon, someone would mention it. "Remember Lila?" They'd say, half in awe, half in disbelief. Captain Raymond, who had continued flying until retirement, kept a copy of that flight's log. On the final page, next to the maintenance report about the cracked valve, he had written a single note in pen. "Warning received. Source unknown. Outcome miracle." Years later, when the plane itself was retired from service, one of the engineers who had worked on the investigation visited the hangar before it was scrapped. He ran his hand over the newly replaced outflow valve and thought about that strange case. The exact cause of the crack had never been fully explained. It wasn't age, it wasn't the temperature, it was just there. He stood back and watched as the lights dimmed for the last time. In that quiet, he remembered Lila's words from the report. "Someone whispered it in my ear." He didn't believe in ghosts. But alone in that empty hangar, he found himself listening anyway, just in case. When the official investigation closed, and the airline moved on, most people forgot about Flight 472. But for those who were there, the crew, the passengers, the captain, it became a story they couldn't shake off. It wasn't about the mechanical failure or the emergency descent anymore. It was about that moment before it all happened, about the warning no one should have known. In the weeks that followed, Lila disappeared quietly from airline life. She returned to her small apartment in Chicago and stayed out of contact with nearly everyone from the crew. Sandra tried calling a few times, leaving messages that went unanswered. Eventually, she stopped trying. She figured Lila needed space. But one evening, months later, Sandra received a letter. It was handwritten, the kind of careful penmanship that looks like someone had taken time to think over every word. Sandra, I've been thinking a lot about that night. I don't expect anyone to believe what I heard, and maybe that's for the best. I'm not sure if it was a warning or something else, something beyond what we can explain. For days after the flight, I kept hearing faint echoes of that same voice. Not words this time, just a feeling of calm. Like whoever it was wanted me to know the danger had passed. I haven't heard it since, and maybe I never will again. I'm grateful you didn't think I was losing my mind. I know it was hard to believe, but you listened, and that meant everything. I think I was meant to be on that flight. Maybe not to serve or work, but to say something before it was too late. I don't think I'll ever step on a plane again, but I'll always be thankful that everyone walked away safe. Take care, Lila. Sandra folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her journal, alongside her old crew ID. Every time she read it, the memory of that whisper returned. How Lila's face had gone pale, how she had spoken with that strange, unshakable certainty. It wasn't fear, it was knowledge. Over time, the story of that flight turned into something like an airline legend. Recruits heard about it during layovers, told in hushed tones over coffee in crew lounges. Some believed it completely, others rolled their eyes. But everyone remembered one thing: the exact timing, 10 minutes before the failure, 10 minutes that made all the difference. Captain Raymond, who retired a year later, often said it was one of the strangest moments of his career. "You can train for everything," he told a younger pilot once, "but there's no manual for a voice that knows the future." He kept a note from that flight in his logbook until the day he handed it in. Just one line: "She warned us before the system did." For Lila, life after flying was quiet. She moved to a small town by the water, took up painting, and lived alone. Sometimes she'd go for long walks along the shore when the wind was high. Locals said she always looked like she was listening to the wind, to the sea, to something unseen. One autumn evening, years later, Sandra found herself assigned to another polar route, this time from Toronto to Helsinki. The route was familiar, the landscape the same endless expanse of white beneath them. As the cabin lights dimmed, she thought of Lila again. She caught herself glancing toward the galley, half expecting to see that same pale face, that quiet certainty. The flight went perfectly. Smooth skies, calm air. But as the plane crossed into the long stretch over the Arctic, Sandra felt something strange, a soft shift in the cabin air, the faintest whisper of static through her earpiece. It was nothing, probably just interference. Still, for a fleeting moment, she thought she heard words. "You're safe this time." She froze, staring out at the blue-black horizon where faint curtains of northern light rippled across the sky. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe it was just the wind. But she smiled anyway and whispered back, "Thank you." When they landed in Helsinki, she didn't mention it to anyone. She didn't need to. Some things, she thought, are meant to stay unproven. That night, lying in her hotel bed, she opened her phone and scrolled to a photo she'd kept all these years, a crew picture from before that fateful flight. Lila stood in the middle, smiling shyly, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes bright. It struck Sandra that maybe Lila hadn't been given a curse that night, but a gift. Maybe someone or something had been watching over them, using her voice just once to make sure everyone made it home. No one ever knew who whispered to her, or how. But everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever it was, it came not with fear but with purpose. And in aviation, where everything runs on precision, data, and control, there are still moments, rare and unexplainable, that remind even the most rational minds that not everything up there can be measured. In the end, the mystery of Flight 472 became more than a story about a mechanical failure. It was about a moment that defied logic, a whisper that came before the danger, a warning no machine could have given. Everyone who was there carried it with them in different ways. For the captain, it was a lesson in humility. Even with decades of experience and all the technology in the world, there were still things he couldn't explain. For Sandra, it was a quiet reminder that instinct, faith, or something beyond either still had a place in the skies. And for Lila, it marked the end of her flying days. She never returned to the air, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Whatever had spoken to her that night had done so for a reason, and she didn't need to chase that reason any further. She often said later that some messages are meant to be heard only once. Years later, her name still came up in crew lounges and training sessions, a story whispered among flight attendants who sometimes looked out the cabin windows and wondered if the skies held more than just clouds and wind. The truth of what happened to Lila that night will probably never be proven. Maybe it was intuition, sharpened by exhaustion and adrenaline. Maybe it was something else entirely. But what mattered most was that she listened, and because she did, 214 people made it home safely. Some stories don't need proof to be true. They just need to be remembered.